coming again. There's a change in the wind. I can feel hope coming again.
Welcome to the program Chemically Speaking. This is a special session that's designed to help you in a variety of ways. This session may give you some insight and some input and understanding on the issues of addictions and the use of chemical substances. You might be here because you're exploring ways of trying to get free from the use of these substances. This is an opportunity for you at the end of this session to take the steps that you need to get free and to get help. I'd like to introduce to you George Patricki. George is someone who's worked in the area of helping people with substance abuse for quite some years. He has worked at the coalface on the streets, he works in counselling those with drug dependency issues, and he also works in high schools in the education area, helping people understand the use of drugs and the consequences. So thanks, George. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Helen. I appreciate the opportunity to come and share with you a little bit about drug and alcohol use and the risks and consequences. I'm from St Kilda Gatehouse, and I've spent the last 21 years associated with drugs. That has meant 7 years in the drug scene myself and about 14 years out. In the last couple of years, I've been doing a graduate certificate in addiction studies, and that's helped gain some insights as to some of the physical consequences of drug use, as well as the psychological, which I'm going to share with you when I cover the cycle of addiction. So this information will help you think through what drug use actually means to you. So the first thing I'd like to say is that in life, we have a whole mixture of joy and pain. No one has all joy or all pain in their lives. We always have a mixture of both. If there was some way we can measure it, let's just say that everybody walks around with at least 10 points worth of pain, say a person walking down the street. And I would also like to say that it's natural to try to avoid pain. If I have a backache, I try to sit in the chair in a certain way that will take away the pain. If it's severe pain, I will take something like Panadine Forte to alleviate the pain. So it's natural for us to seek ways to deal with our pain. We'll come back to that after. Now, as we stumble across life, we may encounter chemicals, perhaps at school or at a party, and we'll experiment with them. And as we do, this is what we'll discover. Here is low, normal, and high. Now, from normal, I will experience a high, and I will think to myself, that felt good. In actual fact, not only did it feel good, just for about 4 to 6 hours, I forgot about that 10 points worth of pain inside. Now, that could be family breakdown issues, could be the breakdown of a relationship, could be parking fines. The bottom line is we all have pain, and a particular chemical that we stumble across will actually take that away. So we think to ourselves, I wouldn't mind doing that again. So we do. Again, here's low, normal and high. And we go from normal to high again, and again, and again, and again. And so we develop a social, or if you like, a recreational use of our chemicals. And so once a month, we are taking these drugs and they're achieving the same objective. And that works fine. And I think to myself, you know, I'm in control here. I'm not going to be like that smack freak over there, or like the alcoholic, or like the cone head. I'm in control. You see, I'm only going to use X amount of times per month, and I'm only going to spend X amount of dollars. And that works fine for a while. But then a couple of things happen. Kind of sneaks up behind us when we're not looking. The first, when we score our drugs, they forget to give us a little black instruction booklet that says, by the way, you're going to develop tolerance. what that actually means is that our bodies adjust to the chemicals that go in. And as our bodies adjust, our need for chemicals actually increase to achieve the same effect. So not only is tolerance a problem, which causes us to increase our drug use from 1/4 of a cap to 1/2 to 3/4 to 1, what actually happens is there is a certain kind of motivation that causes us to increase our drug use. Now, I'll ask you a question. Do you like to feel good every day or just once a month? Now, of course we all like to feel good every day. So therefore, when I use my drug once a month, all of a sudden I encounter a particular crisis. Something comes along and I think, stuff it. I felt good last month, I'm going to do it again. And so from once a month, my drug use may move to once a fortnight or once every few days. And so the desire to feel good daily is a huge motivation which causes people to increase their drug use. And so as they do, they move to the next level of drug use called harmful dependency. Now, we'll see in a moment what that actually looks like, but what I would like to do is to actually think through some of the risks and the consequences associated with this pattern of drug use. So let's just carefully go through some of the risks and the consequences. Now, if I was to ask you, what are some of the things that are not so good about drug use? We talked about a couple of the benefits. We talked about the fact that it feels good, helps us forget about our pain. But what are some of the things that are not so good about drug use? Usually, the first thing that people think of is the health consequences. And so I'll break them down into both physical and mental health consequences. What are some of the physical consequences that result with drug use? Here are some. There is the obvious, overdose, but some of the things that people don't often think about is the damage that drugs do to our brain. The brain neuron damage, or drugs affect the brain, particularly alcohol. Chronic, ongoing, long-term use of alcohol can cause severe brain injury, especially when it's excessive. And an area that alcohol damages quite a lot, of course, is the liver. Many of you would have heard of cirrhosis of the liver, and the liver can become inflamed and it ceases to function properly. Now, alcohol is an interesting drug because many people are not aware of the consequences of excessive alcohol use. We understand that an adult male's body is able to process, as a maximum, 4 to 5 glasses of beer or pots of beer a day within 24 hours. A question that I'd like to ask is, where do you think the other 2, 3, 4, 5 glasses go? If we can only process within 24 hours 4 or 5 glasses a day, where's the other 3, 4 or 5 gone? It goes to every cell in our body. And this is why people experience a whole range of health consequences as a result of excessive alcohol use, such as damage to the brain, the liver, the heart, the vascular system, etc. The kidneys. Now, apart from our liver working overtime to break down the chemicals through enzymes, our kidneys are also working overtime to purify the blood. And an interesting thing that people aren't aware of is that there are certain drugs that can cause a severe effect on the kidneys. One of them is ecstasy. I had a client a little while ago who experienced renal failure as a result of taking one ecstasy tablet. Now, I've had other clients who've had many ecstasy tablets that haven't experienced that. But you never know how your body will respond. And this is the problem with drug use. Our bodies are individual, and just because it's safe for one individual, it doesn't mean it's safe for us. And so we must be very careful. Another area is the lungs. Now, if I say what are the problems of drug use towards our lungs, probably the first thing you'll think of is tobacco. And you're right. Research has shown over the last 40 years that if there are 100 tobacco smokers and we watch them, say, over a 30-year period, 99 out of 100 will experience some sort of severe consequences of smoking. Now, that can be emphysema, it could be chronic bronchitis, it could be cancer of the lungs, the throat, the tongue, or the mouth. What we do know is that 99 out of those 100 people will experience one of those problems, but we don't know whether it'll be in the 12th year or the 18th or the 27th. But if we wait for 30 years, we know that 99 out of those 100 people will experience severe health problems. Now, this is what people aren't told, and this is what people need to know, is that cannabis contains cancer-causing chemicals just like tobacco. We know that tobacco has 9 cancer-causing chemicals, like benzopyrenes, but 5 of those exist in cannabis, and in actual fact exist in a potency much stronger than tobacco. One of the problems that we have is that people inhale it more deeply and hold it in longer. Therefore, the damage can be very severe with ongoing cannabis use. This is kind of what it looks like. 1 marijuana cigarette will equal 7 to 10 normal cigarettes because of the concentration. And if people are using both, then they will experience a double bonus. There's some of the physical problems resulting with drug use, but we also have risk-taking behaviour. For example, those who share needles can experience hepatitis B and C and D and E and F and all the rest of them, and HIV. Then there are the mental health consequences. Now, some of these are not so well known, although people who smoke marijuana will identify with some of these. Now, let's just have a look at them. Paranoia. Many drugs will cause paranoia. They've got this room bugged. They're after me. They hate me. You hate me. And people experience paranoia but don't often realise that it's actually happening to themselves. Usually it takes other people around them to notice it. Okay? The loss of short-term memory is a very common side effect of most drugs, but particularly cannabis. Now, when I refer to cannabis, I'm not just speaking of marijuana, I'm speaking of hash and hash oil as well. The reason why the short-term memory is affected is because the THC in marijuana can last 6 or more weeks inside our bodies, and it gets stored in our body fats and our brain lipid tissue, and particularly affects the frontal lobes of the brain. And this is why many people will identify with this when I say that marijuana causes short-term memory loss. Like, where did I put my keys? What was I supposed to do today? Some of you will know what I'm talking about. Then there is the loss of motivation. Now, again, it's not motivation towards things that we enjoy, such as food or going to the movies or going out. It's motivation for responsibility type of things. Could be vocational things, looking for a job, responsibilities in the home. And many of you will identify with that. But again, it usually takes people that you live with to see that this loss of motivation has occurred. Now, another one that is quite common is the loss of concentration. And this happens as a result of the same effect of the memory loss. And again, it's not concentration like watching a movie. We're talking about high skills kind of concentration, like studying or working in an office type environment. Now, one that families complain a lot about to me are the personality changes associated with drug use. Things like mood swings, anxiety, depression, irritability, and so on. Now, another important one that must be covered is the risk of psychosis. There are certain drugs that can cause psychosis, such as schizophrenia, like excessive stimulants, amphetamines and cocaine, and inhalants is known to cause psychosis in many people. But there are also drugs like cannabis, marijuana, that can trigger psychosis. Not that it causes it in all smokers, but what it does, if the illness is there, marijuana is sure to bring it out. In fact, by coincidence, many of the people that have schizophrenia in our office that come into the drop-in centre just so happens were smoking marijuana between the ages of 14 and 19. So there's a real serious risk there. So here are some of the health consequences associated with drug use. Now let's move away from health. Let's look at some of the other areas of our life that are affected as a result of drug use. There are financial problems. Instead of buying my jeans or paying my rent, I buy my drugs. If I need the money and I ain't got it, what am I going to do? I'll probably resort to some type of criminal activity to obtain my drugs. And there are legal consequences, driving over 0.05, for example. So there are many legal problems, apart from the fact that many drugs are illegal, but also the consequences that result in taking them. And then there is the effect of drugs on our work and our school performance. Now, it's a research fact that people who use drugs take more time off work and school than people that don't use drugs. And that includes cigarettes as well. Why? Because they generally experience a whole range of health consequences as a result of their drug use, and their immune system also breaks down much easier. A very important one that must be mentioned is the effect of drugs on relationships. Now, you'll probably find that the people that complain about this one are those that are in relationship with a drug user. For example, a spouse or children or parents. Relationships are affected on two different levels. There's their effect upon family relationships and those with friendships. What happens is, once we start using drugs, we tend to leave behind many of our family and many of our non-drug using friends, and we tend to gravitate towards drug using friends. And as we leave behind many significant relationships, we become isolated and alienated from them. Okay? Another problem we experience as a result of drug use and how that affects relationships is that it's very hard to connect with people heart to heart when you're using drugs, because generally you're on one level and they're on another. There's two more important areas that I'd like to cover, and that's the spiritual effects of drugs. The most common one that people complain about is shame. Now you may say, what are you talking about spiritual? Well, shame is not a physiological thing. It's not as a result of sort of some chemicals going out of whack. Shame is a response to things that happen here. Now remember when I said I wasn't going to do this, this and this and this? And I start to experience a whole range of consequences as a result of my drug use? I feel like a dog. I said I wasn't going to use my money for paying my rent for my drugs, and I'm using it. I'm neglecting my family. I feel lousy about that. That's shame. Okay? Another important area which I must talk about is coping mechanism. What do I mean by coping mechanism? Okay. Here, my drug use was about having fun, curiosity, whatever. And all of a sudden, I discovered when I was stressed, remember when I was stressed and I started increasing my drug use, that the drug made me feel better. And then when I was depressed, and then when I was fearful and anxious, and pretty soon, I had no feelings left that I didn't need drugs for. Therefore, I became dependent on my drugs for my daily functioning. And this is one of the dangers of coping mechanism, is that instead of depending on my God-given resources, I start to become dependent on my drugs to cope with my daily responsibilities. So this is sort of what happens. That I have 10 points worth of pain, I experience a whole range of consequences, and if I was to add them up, people say, oh yeah, out of 100, all of these add up to 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 points. But let's just say the average is around about 70 points worth of pain that people generally tell me. So they start off with their 10, they accumulate another 70, and now they're in a worse shape, 80 points, than when they started off. True? Yeah. So because they're feeling a lot more lousy than when they started off, they feel lower than what they did here. And they quite often don't get as high, and they start to deteriorate. This is why it doesn't take long for people to end up with what they call full-blown addiction. And that sort of looks like this. Low, normal, high. You see, I'm using drugs just to feel normal, to get through the day. Some of you identify with that? Okay. So what's the bottom line? The bottom line is this. My drug use is about escape. You see, I don't like myself. I don't like this world that I live in. I'm going to create a chemical world to live in where I feel safe and where there is no pain. So before I say anything else, I need to say this, that the journey out of drug dependency is about embracing our pain. It's about facing the real issues in our life and tapping into the resources that God has placed within us to deal with pain and to cope with responsibility. So the first step towards the journey forward is personal responsibility. It's not my mother's fault. It's not my grandmother's fault. I made a choice to use drugs. I make a choice to stop. We just had a look at the risks and the consequences associated with drug use, and we've understood that drugs are a coping mechanism. What I'd like to do now is to just look at the stages of change to see that we actually move forward in consecutive phases. A couple of guys from America called Prochaska and De Clemente did a study on about 10,000 smokers. And what they found in their interviews is that smokers fitted into 5 very clear categories, or if you like, stages. Let's just have a quick look at those, because they actually apply not only to smokers, but also to those that use other chemical substances and, in fact, other addictive behaviour, such as gambling, sexual addiction, and so on. The first stage people are usually in is what they call pre-contemplation. The words pre means before, and contemplation means to think about. So pre-contemplation means I'm not even thinking about changing. In actual fact, why should I when there's no problem? You see, you're my problem, leave me alone, and everything's okay. Now that's usually the first stage people are in when they're into experimental or social use of their drugs. They're not tapping into any problems associated with their drug use generally. Now once people begin to identify some of those health risks that we were talking about before, then they begin to say, yeah, I've got a problem. And so you would call them contemplators, those people in contemplation. It means that they're thinking about some of the problems associated with their drug use, and they're thinking, well, maybe I need to do something about that. After a while, they move to the third stage, which is what they call decision. In this decision phase, they say things like this: well, I acknowledge I've got a problem, as I've said before, and here it was, yes, I've got, no, I don't want to change. Whereas now they're saying, yes, I've got a problem and I'd like to change. Maybe not right this minute, but say within a month. Within a month, I'd like to make a decision to deal with my drug problems. And so what we find is that while people are trying to move from here to here, there's an agonising going on in their soul. They're in what they call ambivalence. They're trying to weigh up the risks versus the benefits. Now, some of you here tonight are in this category, and you're saying to yourself, I love it, but I hate it. I want to stop, but I don't really want to stop. So, you know what I'm talking about? Now, once you make a decision to break through and you say to yourself, well, that's it, I've had enough, you then go into action. Now, action means that a person has actually taken a step and they've stopped what they said that they would do. Okay? So they move out of decision, they take action, and they take a whole lot of steps to remain focused. Such as, don't visit such and such. Don't ring such and such. Change my phone number, get counselling, do a whole range of things that I need to do to stay focused on my decision. So I've taken action now and everything's going fine. After about 6 months, it becomes normal not to ring certain people, not to go to Footscray or Springvale or Dandenong or Frankston or wherever was my drug scoring area, okay? And I'm still attending counselling. And I'm doing a whole lot of stuff that's kept me focused. And it sort of becomes normal now. You know, it's part of my life to go to counselling. It's part of my life to not visit certain kinds of people. I've changed my phone number, I'm used to it. And I'm in what they call maintenance. And after a period of time in maintenance, I think there's an exit point. Some may disagree with me, but I personally feel that there is an exit point. For me, I was in maintenance for a couple of years where I was still at risk. But after a few years, drugs were no longer an issue for me. I have no intentions of going back, I never will. I've left them behind. They're no longer part of my life, they're not important. So I've exited out of maintenance. Okay, I need to say that. So something that's very important that we must talk about is the issue of lapse. Now, what do I mean by lapse? Research has shown when people have moved forward out of their drug use, unfortunately, 90% of people will stuff up at least once. Now, it could be, for example, that I attend a party and Steve's there at the party, he offers me a free taste and I think, I don't want to do this anymore. No, Steve, no, I'm not going to do it. But then, you know, he keeps on pressuring, there are people around, I'm feeling good, I want to keep raging, and I use. Or I'm feeling lousy and I use. Either way, I stumble and I have a lapse. Now, this is what we need to understand. We can make a choice not to go from a lapse to a full-blown relapse. What's the difference? A lapse is, I made a mistake. Now, a relapse is, I continue to repeat that same mistake and I make choices to go back to where I've come from. 80% of these people go on to experience relapse. One of the strongest motivating factors is this: shame. I'm lousy, I'm no good, I'm a failure. I've always been a failure. I was always told I was no good and I'll never amount to anything. And so as soon as we stuff up once, bang, we lose the plot. Now, I need to say as strongly as I can, mistakes do happen, but you do not have to go to relapse. You can make choices. And it's your choice as to whether you go to 1, 2, 3, or 4. You see, you don't have to go to 1 unless you make a choice to. True? And you don't have to go to 2 unless you choose to. Nor do you have to go to 3 unless you make a choice to. You can go to 4. Straight back to action again, if you choose. And that's very important because the key to recovery, as I said before, is that we take personal responsibility for our decision-making processes. I made a choice to use at the party. I had pressure and the triggers will always be there. But at the end of the day, I made the choice. Therefore, I make the choice to stop. And this is what we must remember in our journey of recovery is that we can make right choices. We weren't born drug addicts or rapers or murderers or anything like that. We made choices, and often those negative choices lead to negative consequences. Now that we've looked at the stages of change and how we actually move forward out of our dependency, it's important that we take a moment to look at some of the triggers, some of the predisposing factors that cause us to develop problematic drug use. Particularly earlier on, when we're looking at the cycle of addiction, we were talking about coping mechanisms. Unfortunately, many of us walk around with things that are locked inside, and these things almost subconsciously drive us towards looking for escape-type behaviour. One of the most common things is the grief cycle. Now, I'm just going to share with you a little bit about that, and what we'll see is that sometimes when there are certain traumas, or if you like, loss, that we experience. Now, it could be the loss of a loved one, it could be a trauma such as an accident, or it could be something that people have done to us to traumatise us, such as abuse. We will respond to those things as a result of the pain that we experience. Now, the phases that we sort of go through are not quite neat little areas that last for about a week. Our emotional makeup is very individual and we respond quite differently. But what I'd like to say is that we do eventually go through most of these phases in some kind of an order. So the first thing that we normally experience is what they call shock or denial. Now that can be as simple as, I'm not going to deal with this. When my father passed away about 9 years ago, there was a whole lot of stuff that I never resolved with him. And I didn't have time to deal with it. So I wasn't prepared to deal with it at that point of my life. So I just shut down my emotions for about 3 months. And I wasn't prepared to process it. I hid behind trying to protect my mother and my sisters, but in reality, I wasn't prepared to deal with my pain, okay? Once we start to connect with the pain inside, we'll often experience a regret type phase. Some people call it bargaining. And this is what sort of happens. If only I said this. If only I would have done that, it wouldn't have happened. And so the regret and the bargaining often give way to a very, very difficult emotional response called anger. Now this anger can be expressed towards ourselves, or it can be expressed towards others. More often than not, it'll be expressed towards both sides. Now, in a moment, we are going to look a little bit more closely towards anger, because many people that experience problematic drug use, especially with opiates, such as heroin, are stuck in the anger phase, but also the depression phase, which is the next one. Now, when I say depression, what am I talking about? I'm talking about that state or that sense of hopelessness or helplessness. When you think of depression, some people think of the chemical imbalances that result and people have to take antidepressant medication. Now that often happens too, but oftentimes that's long-standing depression that results as a result of this sort of stuff that happens here and is unresolved, okay? So from depression and anger, eventually people make a choice to move on. And they call this stage acceptance. And acceptance simply means I've made a choice to move on with my life, and I do what has to be done to get well or to deal with these emotions. And eventually when I do that, I'll return to normal, and some people call that resolve, where life returns to normal, whatever that means. But where people mostly get stuck is here and here. So let's just have a quick look at anger. Okay. Anger is a normal human emotion which responds to something that causes our well-being to be threatened or the well-being of someone else. And anger in itself is not wrong and it's not evil. Oftentimes it's how it is expressed that becomes the problem rather than anger per se. Because anger is like a thermometer or an indicator that tells us that something is not well on the inside. If we are a passive type individual, a quieter type of personality style, we tend to transfer that anger towards ourselves. If we are an extrovert, or if you like, an outgoing type of individual, then we will tend to express that anger towards others. Again, the pendulum will often swing towards both sides. Now, anger exists on 3 levels and escalating in severity. Level 1 is the verbal anger. Now, many of you will very quickly identify with what I'm talking about here. Self-contempt, self-hatred, or self-directed anger can be things like, you're stupid, you're a moron, you're no good. If it's directed towards other people, it's, you're stupid, you're a moron, you're no good. That's level 1 type of anger. And it can be expressed either inwardly or outwardly. If the anger remains unresolved and it's more traumatic and severe, then you will experience and you will see more of level 2 type of anger, which is then the physical. Now, level 2 anger will result in assaults and violence towards other people, picking fights and so forth. Now, how many times do you walk into a nightclub or a pub or something and you see the people have had too much to drink and they become violent and abusive, and you think, mate, what's happened to him? He's normally a really quiet sort of person. He turns into an animal when he has a few drinks. Because alcohol is a disinhibitor. And as the social boundaries are taken out of the way, what's inside erupts and comes out. Okay? If this physical anger is directed towards ourselves, it is then expressed in what they call self-mutilation. That can be slashing ourselves, hurting ourselves in some kind of way. If this anger continually escalates and is suppressed and it is not resolved, then the risk is that it will move towards level 3 type of anger, which ends up in death. And of course, they call that suicide, if it's directed towards ourselves, or murder, if it's directed towards other people. So anger is a very difficult area for people to work through. And so it's very important that if we feel stuck in anger, we need to seek help. And that brings us to the conclusion of this session, where we'd like to offer you as an individual the opportunity to move forward in your life. And if you've been using chemicals and you've thought perhaps it was about recreational and social use, and all of a sudden you realise that there have been many risks and consequences as a result of your drug use, and yet it's really not about social and recreational use, and you know that, then we are giving you the opportunity to receive some help. And if you're thinking that you'd like to discuss your options, your facilitators will direct you to a variety of services that are available. And when we were talking before about level 3 type of anger which results in death, oftentimes drug abuse is a slow form of suicide, where we begin to experience self-destructive consequences, and we continue to do that even after doctors have said, if you continue to drink, you're going to die because your liver is going to be inflamed with cirrhosis and all the rest of it, or you'll die of a heroin overdose, or whatever the case may be. We continue to take those life-threatening risks. If you're planning on moving forward, what are your options? Well, you can move towards either an outpatient treatment program or perhaps even an inpatient live-in residential rehabilitation. You can discuss those options with your facilitators. An outpatient program generally will involve counselling to help you think through and work through a variety of personal issues, but it'll also get you thinking about what are some of the triggers and what are some of the high-risk situations in your life. What are the things that can trigger you to go back towards your drug use? And the counselling is a very important part of the healing process because it'll help you to become objective and take one step back and look at your life circumstances and start putting together the pieces of your life, particularly things like relationship areas where relationships have been harmed or even destroyed as a result of drug use with family or with friends. And we'd like to now just close this part of the session and we'll go into the discussion about the options and the services that are available. Thank you.